Why can't we be enough clever never to?
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Skip Rutherford. I'm Dean of the Clinton School, and welcome to another in a great series of programs that Nikolai DePippa runs. We've got students here from the University of Arkansas. Thank you for coming down. We've got people here that are reading this book as part of a book club. We've got Clinton School students here, Board of Trustee members here, and a lot of alumni from various fraternities here. So this should be an interesting conversation. John Hechinger is a graduate of Yale, and he works with Bloomberg News. Before joining Bloomberg, he was with the Wall Street Journal. He was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Public Service, and he's won the Camp Award for Outstanding Writing in Education. So he's followed the education issues for a long time. And he's now written this book that has sparked a great deal of interest and comment. It is True Gentleman. John, welcome to the Clinton School.
Skip, thank you so much for having me, and thank you. It's a tremendous honor to be here at the school, which I've just been amazed at. I took a tour today of the library in the school, and I'm thrilled to be part of the conversation.
Well, in the spirit of, in full disclosure, let me say that as an undergraduate, I was president of Phi Delta Theta Fraternity. So I want to put that on the table, that as we get into this, that you can say whatever you want to. Okay. It'll be okay. I'm a big boy. Okay, John. So for over 50 years, there have been at least one hazing death in the fraternity system in America. Some years a lot more. I believe in 2012 there were 7. But last year, in 2017, there were 4. And this is from the Chronicle of Higher Education, not even your book. Andrew Coffey, 20, of Pompano Beach, Florida, was a civil engineering student in Phi Kappa Phi Pledge at Florida State University. He died in early November at an off-campus Big Brother party that the fraternity's executive committee had organized. Matthew Ellis, 20, of Humble, Texas, was a business administration major in Phi Kappa Psi Pledge at Texas State University. He was found unresponsive after an off-campus initiation event in mid-November. Maxwell Groover, 18, of Roswell, Georgia, hoped to become a sports writer and was a Phi Delta Theta pledge at Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge. He was declared dead at a hospital in early September following an initiation ritual called Bible study, in which pledges were repeatedly asked to drink. Timothy Piazza, 18, of Lebanon, New Jersey, was an engineering student and a Beta Theta Pi pledge at Penn State. He died in early February 2017 after taking part in a drinking ritual called the Gauntlet. And that one, of course, was the one where the young man was laid in the fraternity house for hours, and no one called to report his injury or death. So as you hear about these 4 incidents and you write this book, the 2 or 3 questions I would like to start with was, how bad is it? Number 2, is anything being done about it? And then number 3, why SA?
All good questions.
Okay.
Well, this last year has been a particularly horrific year. Not one of the worst on record, but it illustrates the real many of the problems that are sort of central. One is they all took place during pledging, which is a proud, as alumni here know, is a proud part of fraternity life, but is often really just a polite word for hazing. The research in my book found that surveys have shown that 3/4 of fraternity members say they've been pledged. So say they've been hazed. So hazing is the rule, not the exception. And all of these deaths also involved excessive drinking, being forced to drink until the students pass out. And this is also very typical of the pledging and the hazing process. And I think what we've found this year is that the public has lost patience in many ways with the behavior of fraternities. And you have major campuses, big public universities that are suspending all of Greek life, often for many months. And sometimes you have the fraternity members themselves saying that it's just too dangerous to hold parties. You've seen that at Michigan, at Indiana, and at several other schools. So I think we're really at a kind of a turning point. We have presidents of the big research universities are meeting in April to discuss the future of fraternities. So I think it's a time where we may see a great deal of change on the horizon. Now, you asked about SAE. So the book, sort of the main character of the book is Sigma Alpha Epsilon, and I became interested in the fraternity because I wrote a series of articles for Bloomberg that called SAE the deadliest fraternity, because they had 10 deaths in over a decade, more than any other fraternity. And one of the striking things about SAE is after the book came out, they really embraced the findings of the series. The leadership, particularly a president, Brad Cohn, who had become increasingly alarmed that the fraternity would cease to exist, that the insurer would drop their coverage. And so he didn't want to be head of an organization that had been around since 1856 and be its last president. So he was willing to open up to me when I suggested doing a book. He was willing to, give me incredible access. I'd never, in many years of doing investigative reporting, I'd never seen an organization this open to, inviting me to meetings and discussing some of the most sensitive episodes of the history, inviting me to their archives where I discovered some really eye-opening transcripts that had been secret about the fraternity's attitudes toward black and Jewish members in the 1950s. So I found that they were very, very serious about this. So I kind of saw in SAE an organization that represented the worst of fraternities. It was the deadliest fraternity. It was at the center of a terrible racial episode in 2015 at the University of Oklahoma, which was captured in a cell phone video, where you had members celebrating lynching and talking about how they would never have an African American member of SAE, except they used a different, much worse word. So they had all of these terrible things, but they also were serious about reform. And so as I tried to figure out what the future might be for fraternities, I thought there would be no better place to start.
And so SAE then basically cooperated with you in the writing of this book. And so what's happening today in your work with SAE, or in your, what do you see that they've done differently?
Well, the biggest thing that SAE did is that in 2014, SAE eliminated pledging, which was really an astonishing thing for the organization. There was a lot of opposition. Brad Cohn, the president, was attacked constantly on social media for saying that he didn't understand the importance of pledging for the sort of bonding of young members. But he stuck with it, and he did it without, it was an emergency action that he and the Supreme Council, the governing body, took. He did not put it to a vote, because every time he put it to a vote for undergraduate member, put other measures to a vote, like eliminating alcohol and chapter houses, it would fail. And what happened was that since then, in the decade before, they were the deadliest fraternity. Since then, they have not had another fatal hazing episode. Their insurance rates which were once the highest in all of fraternities, declined by 90%. They also had to enforce this, so they shut down more than 30 chapters. Just this year, they shut down the University of Texas at Austin. They shut down the University of Mississippi. And just recently the University of Kansas. So they've been very serious about enforcing these rules, and they'd be the first to admit that hazing and out of control drinking are still a problem. But the research that I did showed that this policy was very effective. So I think that in some ways that could be a model going forward.
So, and again, kudos to the SAEs for making positive strides. Could this book have been written about the Phi Deltas, the Sigma Nus, the Lambda Chi's, the Sig Eps? Could it have been written about other fraternities? If you had gone in, could you have traced this through other fraternities and said, you may not be as deadly as the quote SAEs, but you're probably every bit as troublesome?
Absolutely. I mean, I saw SAE as emblematic. It's one of the largest fraternities, but I didn't see it as, in some ways, that different from many other fraternities. And in fact, I talk a lot in the book about Phi Delta Theta, your fraternity.
Yeah, I read a little bit about
that. And, the Phi Deltas went through a very similar episode. They had a lot of deaths in the 1990s through 2000, 3 really horrific alcohol-related deaths, and there was the same kind of concern. And Phi Delta Theta took action as SAE did, and instituted a policy that said that there would be no, you probably know better than I do, but there would be no drinking in chapter houses. There'd be no parties with alcohol. It was also extremely unpopular at the time among many undergraduates. There were people who said that the fraternity would essentially disappear, no one would want to join them, but Phi Delta Theta grew dramatically over that time period. It's bigger, I think I'm right, it's bigger now than it was back then. And has not until, unfortunately, quite recently, had another death. They did have, LSU was actually a Phi Delta Theta house. So it also shows that, none of these efforts are perfect. So I think I could have chosen another fraternity. I'm not sure any other fraternity would have cooperated to this extent. So that's the...
Here's something you write, which I think is interesting. At many schools, especially the public universities that award most bachelor degrees, the Greek letter groups that dominate the physical and social landscape have a greater influence on student lives than any academic department. Visit a college with a flourishing fraternity scene, and you'll find an office of Greek life where administrators endorse materials that make fraternity gatherings sound as innocent as square dancing. Stroll along Fraternity Row, and you'll find jaw-dropping mansions that look like the set of Gone with the Wind. Greek organizations own $3 billion in real estate on 800 U.S. campuses, offering some of the most expensive and sought-after housing and dividing campuses into haves and have-nots. Their members form a voting bloc that gives them unrivaled power in student government, and later a lifelong social network that can catapult them ahead of less connected classmates. About 40% of U.S. presidents have belonged to fraternities. There's even a lobbying arm, the Fraternity and Sorority Political Action Committee, known as Frat Pack, that opposed national anti-hazing legislation and supported a bill that would make it more difficult for colleges to investigate sexual assault. Would you talk a little bit about the power that the Greek system has on the campus, in the community, through donors, through Board of Trustee members, through legislators, through deans, through presidents, and Congress? I mean, isn't there a pretty strong power base here?
Definitely. I mean, one of the most surprising things that I found in traveling across the country to looking at fraternities is how popular they are. There are something like 400,000 members. That's 50% more than there were 10 years ago. And for all of the headlines, they have an enormous amount of support on campus for a variety of reasons. And one is that they are among the most loyal alumni. At Indiana University, I found a document that showed that they represented 19% of alumni, but made 60% of donations. And so a college president will really be risking his or her career by taking on fraternities. In one chapter, I talk about an episode at the University of North Carolina that really surprised me. It was about a chapter of SAE that had essentially been, had 3 members who had been hospitalized for alcohol poisoning that fall, and that the dean, I think rightly, was very concerned. And in the last case, they had some very powerful evidence against the fraternity, including a dash cam video police officer where the police officer came to this party, and one of the pledges, who was underage, was so drunk that he mistook the patrol car for a taxi, and then he proceeded to leave the patrol car and throw up in the bushes. So it was hard to argue that there wasn't drinking going on, there wasn't underage drinking going on. And later that evening, one of the pledges was found passed out in a local bar, and again was taken to the hospital for alcohol poisoning. What was so fascinating about this is that the members of the fraternity, they fought this very, very, very strongly. And I got access to this incredible 175-page transcript where the president of the fraternity, the young man named Ian Gove, had gotten a state legislator to sit by him and give him legal advice during this disciplinary proceeding. Outside, one of the major donors to the university was waiting with the rest of the members. And what ended up happening was that the university did discipline the chapter and shut them down. But it didn't stop there. The alumni got together, they went to the state legislature and got a law passed that would require that fraternities in any disciplinary proceeding have access to an attorney. And the law was actually named after SAE. Even more than that, the fraternity got 3 new members on the Board of Trustees who were members of SAE. And one of them told me that the main reason that he joined was to get the fraternity back on campus, and that he told the chancellor that you either bring SAE back or else, that you can do it our way or the hard way. And it turned out that within a couple of years, the president was gone. And the fraternity was back. And it was pretty clear to me that decision to take on the chapter, the local chapter, which had been very clearly found to have violated alcohol rules, ended his career at that college. So to me, it was an example of the tremendous power and the difficulty of taking on fraternities.
And again, when you read this book, you look at all the bad stuff and see a bunch of stuff. But in the context of the growth of the fraternity, in the context of the growth of the Greek system, in the context of many, many, many good people who go beyond the bad stuff. So, are we in an era where we're getting these significant bad apples, but we're bringing down or jeopardizing a whole system of people that are really trying to do the right thing, and don't, and in fairness, are not racist and are not alcoholics and do not commit sexual assaults. I mean, in the Greek system, getting in some ways, tainted for bad apples, and I totally agree with bad apples. I don't think anybody in this room would condone that, but there sure are a lot of good people that seem to me are getting tainted here. Is that fair?
Well, I should say that I found much to admire at SAE. The leadership, many of the students I met were very serious about making change, and toward the end of the book, I looked at kind of a chapter that became a model chapter that turned itself around, that kind of lived up to the values of the organization. I mean, I called the book True Gentlemen because that's the creed of SAE, which is these are words that many of the members I spoke to really sought to live by. Their values of sort of honor and integrity and virtue and justice. And I was really trying to take them seriously and look at where kind of SAE was not living up to those words and where members were trying. But I think that the problem is that for all the, fraternities raise $20 million a year for charity. That's certainly true and very important. Fraternities, I found research that showed the people who belong to fraternities often enjoy their college career more, and it is a great career network. But this issue of drinking, for instance, it's clear that members of fraternities drink more than other members other students on campus. I looked at this very long Harvard study about binge drinking on campus, and the rates of binge drinking among fraternity members, it was about 90% as opposed to 45%, which albeit is quite high too among the rest of the students. So the drinking culture, it's not a myth or a stereotype that there's more drinking at fraternities. And most of the problems that we're looking at, the problems of sexual assault, problems of hazing, the accidents, a lot of them can be traced to drinking. So I think that it's a cultural problem, but there are good people within the organization that could change the culture.
On the drinking thing, during the Vietnam years, 60s, 70s, the Greek system took a dip. People didn't join. There were a lot of drugs on campus. And some people thought that it would be the beginning of the end of the Greek system. In the 1980s, they came back in a big way. One of the reasons some people think was back was when the drinking age was raised from 18 to 21. And so it took students from the bars and the restaurants into the fraternity houses, into the fraternity parties, where they actually became just, and I think everybody in this room, or not everybody, but many of my buddies in this room can remember being underage in a fraternity house and having access to alcohol. So do you think that started this real alcohol revolution? I know it's always been there, but it got worse.
I mean, absolutely. In terms of the sort of the insurance industry, research into this, and fraternity's own assessment, the 80s were a big change. That you had, first of all, as you were saying, Skip, that the big problem before the 80s was that for fraternities was that they were essentially disappearing. They just weren't that popular, and there were two things that changed that. One, as you pointed out, was the drinking age change, and the other, strangely enough, was the movie Animal House, which came out in 1978. And for some reason, a lot of people looked at Animal House not as a satire or of college life, but as kind of a guidebook. And it's art following life. So, when fraternities began their resurgence in the 80s, there was a feeling that, wow, this was kind of the golden age of fraternities that was memorialized in Animal House. They stepped into the void that, the campuses used to be able to provide kegs for parties in official spaces. They couldn't anymore. And so fraternities became kind of essentially underage bars for the entire community. And this is something that colleges knew, other students took advantage of. They were shifting a lot of the risk to fraternities who were eagerly accepting it because it offered a kind of social capital, I think, that was very important on campus. So all of those things made a big difference. And I think one of the problems that we're seeing now, why it's maybe worse, is that during the 80s, it was a little bit more about kegs and beer. And there's been a shift toward binge drinking of hard liquor. And it is difficult to drink yourself to death drinking beer, but it's not that hard. When, in these cases you talked about, you ask a young pledge who doesn't know his tolerance to drink a whole bottle of wild turkey. It's easy for them to end up dying.
So you talked about the insurance rates and going down and so forth. So take me through let's say there's a party at a fraternity house. Let's say that one of the officers or two of the officers say, we don't like this, we're not going to participate, and we're going to leave. But the house goes on with the party, and there are 3 or 4 officers there, and 2 or 3 have left and said, we're not going to be a part of it. We don't know what's going to happen, but we're not going to be a part of it. What happens if someone dies?
Well, it helps to sort of start with a little bit about how fraternity insurance works, which is something I think people don't really fully understand. Dating back to the 80s, and certainly the early 90s, the national fraternities were very concerned that if there was a sexual assault or a death from hazing, that they would be subject to multi-million-dollar lawsuits that would put them out of business. So what fraternities did is they crafted insurance policies that excluded hazing, sexual assault, and drinking. In other words, most of the risks that the brothers would face. If any of those activities were being engaged in, the members are no longer covered by the insurance policies that they pay, actually often hundreds of dollars a year for. The national will be covered, but the members are completely on their own. And so what happens after a death is there's inevitably a lawsuit that often goes on for years, and the individual members who participated in the behavior are named, but also the officers. And that was Skip, that was your question. If you're the president of a fraternity or the treasurer of a fraternity, and you know that over the weekend there's going to be some hazing, a big brother night where the young men are going to be forced to drink, and you decide, look, I'm against it, I'm not going to participate, I'm not even going to be there. When there's a lawsuit, you will be named in that lawsuit. And you're not even covered. So the plaintiff's lawyers are going to go after your parents' homeowner's policy, and you're going to be dealing with this for years. And I actually think that this is something that would be really important for members of fraternities and for colleges to publicize. So it would be another reason to change the policy, because in the end it could have a huge impact on your future.
And so that would ultimately go to the parents' home ownership policies, and all right, and that doesn't count the potential criminal things that would happen for those that are there.
That's right. There's also, the prosecutors have gotten a lot more aggressive recently. One of the reasons that hazing is often not punished is in most states it's a misdemeanor that can be subject you to as little as a $500 fine. And what that means is the police are usually not eager to go after hazing. But what's happening now is that when hazing results in death, in Penn State, and in I think also in Florida State and Louisiana State, the police and prosecutors are filing serious charges like manslaughter because those are worth their prosecuting. And that could be hopefully a serious disincentive, but it is extremely hard to prove.
Okay. One area on the fraternities, and one of the things that becomes very critical, is this sort of power, privilege, and oppression, where disadvantaged students, African American students, international students in some cases, are excluded from membership because of the color of their skin or their nationality. How widespread is that now in America? Is it getting any better? Because there were many of us that were, during our days in Greek life, there were no African Americans in any of the fraternities or the sororities. Again, we are in the South. I understand the culture. What are you seeing as you research, as you looked around? Is there progress being made?
Well, one of the sociologists that I quote in the story called fraternity life American apartheid, and I think to some degree, I think he has a point in that the best research that I could find shows that something like 4% of members of historically white fraternities are African American. SAE did its own survey several years ago and found it was about 3%. And I should say that when I'm in the book, I'm really writing primarily about the historically white fraternities that SAE represents. And these are about 70 organizations that are the most powerful on campus, the ones that have the big houses. And they have a history of exclusion. First, exclusion of women. The reason we have sororities is that fraternities in the 19th century and early 20th century, as women became more of a force on campus, they decided to exclude women, and so women's fraternities were born. Same with African American fraternities. So you have a system where if you go to, I spent time at University of Alabama. I have a whole chapter about the University of Alabama where, like most public colleges, the traditionally white fraternities have these unbelievable mansions that are on public property, that are built usually with bond issues, so they're backed by taxpayers. And each is bigger than the next. They keep getting remodeled. African American fraternities don't have houses at all. So it's not only separate, it's unequal. And even though these houses are basically subsidized by the public, what are called old row fraternities at the University of Alabama, these are presumably the most prestigious fraternities, do not have African American members. And this was even when I went in 2015. The sororities at the University of Alabama had no African American women as members until 2013, when a few members stood up to their own alumni and insisted that several women become members, and it became a huge national story. And the president backed them, and now I got some non-public information about the makeup at the University of Alabama. And so each of the sororities, the old traditional sororities, usually has several African American members, which is progress, but still it's a very small percentage. But the fraternities, SAE, when I visited, had never had a black member, and most of the others hadn't. And now, I know we're in Arkansas, so I did not go to the University of Arkansas, but I would, my sense is that there would still be chapters at the University of Arkansas that don't have black members. And that's a big problem. Now, I will also say that there are chapters, fraternities reflect the culture of each campus. So there are chapters of SAE, for instance, that are very diverse, particularly in places like California with kind of newer chapters. But I think it is still a serious problem that needs to be addressed.
And the issue of sexual assault on campus, obviously, on everybody's mind and a very big topic. Is it more widespread in fraternities than it is anywhere? I mean, at least accusations or records or convictions. Are we seeing an increase in that?
Well, when we're talking, sexual assault is very difficult to explore because there's very little good data, and most assaults are not even reported. So you kind of have to start with that. What I did find is that the Justice Department did a study that found that women who frequently go to fraternity parties raise their risk of sexual assault by 1.5 times, and that there's another fairly large study that found that sorority women run 3 times the risk of rape, presumably because they are frequently going to fraternity parties. Now, what we don't know is whether it's whether it has something to do with the fraternities or the environment that they create. And I suspect that an environment where you have underage bartenders serving underage people, often to excess with no adult supervision, and no accountability under the law, leads to an environment where, as one sociologist I spoke to said, sexual assault becomes kind of a predictable outcome. That being said, there's also some elements of the way fraternity parties tend to be set up where you have sort of men in control of the space. Usually, if you're not a member of a fraternity, if you're a male, you can't go to the party, but women are often invited. Freshman women are often, invited so that there are often 2 or 3 times as many women as men at the parties. Often there's sort of a clothing requirement, themes, Victoria's Secret model themes, all these themes where women are kind of objectified. All of that leads to an environment where these problems occur. So I think that the fraternity parties are a dangerous space on campus. I don't think we know enough really to know for sure how much more dangerous, but most of the evidence shows that there's a lot of work to be done there.
We talk about the role of the alumni and how active they are in terms of influence and power and donations and so forth. Could you talk a little bit about the problems that alumni cause in terms of showing up at campus events, hazing pledges, bringing alcohol from the tailgate party to the front porch, with 18 and 19-year-old students trying to police parents. And then you've got, and we'll expand this a little bit, in the social media thing where you've got, and I've lived through this in the last year, where you had a mom and a dad reliving their college days at their son's bid party, with all of them celebrating quite openly on Facebook and being circulated around. How big a problem is, people trying to helicopter back in and relive the glory days?
I think that can be a problem. I think alumni can be part of the solution, or they can be part of the problem. Many of the sort of the reform-minded leaders of the fraternities that I spoke to in the book, they were alumni, and they're really trying to sort of change the culture. But often they'll take a action against a fraternity, but the local alumni will deny and obstruct. And it becomes very difficult. There's one chapter of the book, I look at a college in Maryland where I interviewed a former pledge who was horribly hazed. I mean, he was locked in a basement for 9 hours listening to this pounding German metal music. And then later on, he was asked to strip into his underwear and submerge himself in a huge trash can full of ice while he's in the winter, while he was sprayed with water. He was asked actually to recite the True Gentleman Creed under those conditions, which was ironic and also sort of horrifying. And he was also asked to drink until he passed out. And he very bravely came forward and talked about this to me and also to the college. And in the end, the National Fraternity did shut down this chapter, but to this day, the local alumni still feel like they were unfairly treated, and were fighting and fighting and denying. And I think that makes it difficult. And I understand that many of the local alumni feel really strongly about how important it is to keep the chapter open, but they can often, without really knowing the facts about what happened, they can often get in the way and keep a chapter running far longer than it's safe.
And we'll throw it open to questions here, but I just want to point out that you didn't visit the University of Arkansas, though Bob G. swears that this was the Lambert High House on this book, and it's not. But he told me, he said, "My gosh, that's the Lambert High House at Phil." I said, "No, Bob, that is not." But that's okay. But at the University of Arkansas, right now there are student elections going on. There are 8 candidates, 2 running for president, vice president, secretary, and treasurer. Those elections are underway. They're all Greeks. When I was on campus, the first African American was elected president of the student body, the first woman was elected president of the student body, and an independent was elected president of the student body. So, again, we don't have to reinvent the wheel, and I guess my question is it because that people aren't stepping up and running, or is it because they feel like that there's no opportunities? I read an article in the University of Arkansas Kids that there were filings for the Student Government Senate at the University of Arkansas, and there were positions that were unfilled that nobody ran for. So I guess my question is it a student leadership issue, or is it a Greek domination issue?
Well, I mean, one of the findings in my book was that just how important it is your fraternity membership could be in terms of your success in student government. At the University of Alabama, there's actually a secret machine which decides who gets elected to student government, that has been the source of controversy for many years. And the machine has been dominated by the traditionally white Greek organizations, and as a result, for decades there had been no black student government president until actually when I had visited. And the Elliot Spillers, who became the first African American president at the University of Alabama in 40 years, and the first non-machine candidate, he worked really hard to cultivate friends in Greek life who he respected, who supported him. But I think it's, there's kind of there's a good side of looking at this, and there's a bad side. I mean, the good side is that, fraternities and sororities are leadership organizations, and many of their students become leaders on campus for a reason. They know how to organize, they're ambitious, they want to be successful, so it makes sense that they would go into student government. But if the organizations themselves are not diverse, if they don't reflect the rest of the campus, that's a huge problem. And what I saw at the University of Alabama, and I have no reason to believe that it's that different at many other universities, is that at this point it may not be outright discrimination, but it's a kind of institutional racism. And what I mean by that is that you have a system where it becomes very, very unlikely that an African American student would join the chapter. So in Alabama, and I suspect at the University of Arkansas, there's a huge focus on legacies. That your father was in the fraternity. And often the member that I focused on in the chapter, he was the 4th generation leader of the SAE House. And all the recruiting was done at a handful of colleges around the state, most of them in very heavily white areas, often private schools. If you if you restrict the pipeline that much, it makes it extremely unlikely. And I don't know in Arkansas if it works this way, but in Alabama, many of the members are chosen before students even set foot on campus. They're recruited out of high school. And once again, that's not going to yield a very diverse group. And one example in the chapter, SAE actually did, when I was there, the president that I spoke to, there was a guy he wanted to recruit who was African American from his private school, and he was going to be the first black SAE. He ended up not going to Alabama, so it didn't happen. So, I mean, the challenge I would put out there to anyone at a school that doesn't have a diverse student body is to think about how these kinds of policies, even if you're ostensibly open to everybody, makes it almost impossible to actually have a representative group.
All right, thanks. Now let's throw it open to questions, and we'll get the microphone to you right here. Hold on just a minute.
I was recruited before my freshman year to join the fraternity, and what happened, it was a deceitful manner in which it was done because I didn't drink alcohol and was told that wouldn't be a problem. So that raises a two-pronged question. One, is there steps in place in universities to stop fraternities from using deceitful recruiting? And then two, is there some kind of a support system where people can go if they need to get out of a fraternity if it gets to the point that it's too bad for them to be in?
I mean, that's a really good question. In the case at Salisbury University in Maryland, what was really striking about the deceit is that the young man that I profiled, he when he was asked to join, it was made to sound like they were basically picking people on grades and leadership potential, and the university even had him sign a no hazing pledge, saying that hazing is not at all tolerated. So he was kind of led to believe that there wasn't going to be a problem. He kind of thought, well, maybe he'd have to do some errands or something like that, but nothing serious. And then they started with like kind of light hazing, and it got worse and worse and worse until he felt like he had already kind of invested so much of his self-esteem in this that he wanted to stay. So it was really hard for him to quit. Now he did, but most people, I think what happens is, they're assured that we went through it or whatever, and there's, as you're saying, so much deceit. How is it that on every college website, it's the college says we have a zero tolerance policy for hazing, but that 75% of people in Greek life say they've been hazed. So I do think you're asking if anything is being done about it. I think that that's on a college by college basis, but that's what I think has to be done. It's a good question.
Questions? Yes, sir.
John Stanley. I served on the National Board of Directors of Sigma Phi Epsilon for 8 years. And during that time, we developed the Balanced Band program. And we had the chapters vote to accept it or not, and they instant them individually. And we found that was it helped a great deal. We found a definite turnaround, but we still had problems. And we have closed chapters since that time because of hazing or other events. But I have found, fortunately, I got to attend and visit about 20 campuses and installed about 14 chapters during that time I was on the board. And I found where the school had a major program that assisted the fraternities and sororities, that they had a better experience than other schools. And I think the University of Arkansas now is doing that. And we found that the size of the chapters, both sorority and fraternities, have grown substantially in the last 4 or 5 years because the university has made efforts to visit with the chapters and made efforts to encourage them as well, I understand, is to diversify. And fortunately, the SIG-EPS now I know they have 3 minority members at the University of Arkansas who I got to visit with recently, and very impressive. And I think the membership now is close to 190 members. When I was in school, it's only about 80. So it's a major change. And I think the changes are I see a lot of positive changes in the fraternity system.
Well, it's very, I mean, SIGEP is definitely, SIGEP took steps that were similar to SAE's a number of years ago with that Balanced Man program, which if I understand it correctly, tries to pick students without a kind of a hazing system. So that makes a lot of sense. And it's interesting that there are, you see a lot of progress in Arkansas. The only thing I would say is that if there are 160 members and 3 minority members, probably is not that reflective of the rest of the campus. So there's probably still a lot of work to be done. So.
Anything else? Yes, ma'am. She's coming with the microphone for you.
Is the use of date rape drugs more prevalent in fraternities? And is that one of the things that make prosecuting rape more difficult?
That's a good question. I don't think there's not good data on the use of date rape drugs, and I looked at a lot of cases where date rape drugs are alleged. I just couldn't find that many where people could really sort of find beyond a reasonable doubt. But what I can say is that, most prosecutors will tell you that the most common date rape drug is alcohol. Yeah, and you don't really need anything special if you're serving like a punch spiked with Everclear, and then you're sending out emails. As one fraternity that I write about in here, it wasn't SAE, but giving instructions to members about luring your rape bait. Look for hammered women who are easy prey or whatever. So, and again, I don't think that from the vast majority of members of fraternities, I don't think most people are like that, but you set up an environment like that, and it does make it easy for that to happen. That's a good question.
Yes, Eric Collins, we'll get the microphone to you. Here you go, Bob, right over here.
I just want to say, on behalf of Sigma Chi, I'm on the House Corporation of Fayetteville. These guys are on the House Corporation up there. I'm the current president of the Alumni Association. They both serve that role. I think it's the largest alumni association of any fraternity. And then I serve on the governing rules committee of all the Sigma Chi fraternity. We are committed to running a good ship. And, I haven't learned anything today. I've seen, I've read, I've heard the date rape question. There were several chapters, not Sigma Chi, but fraternities in the last month that Rohypnol turned up in the Hunch Punch at their parties. And so, yeah, it happens. But I just want to say on behalf of Sigma Chi, we're working hard to run a good shop. And, I will say the minority membership thing, I've not seen any minorities attempt to get into our fraternity. I have heard next fall that there is someone that has expressed, I'm talking about the Omega chapter at Fayetteville, that there is someone that has expressed a desire to come on board, and actually everybody's pretty excited about that. So, the alumni thing, talking about are alumni helpful or not? Yes and no. That's a true thing. So, we work hard, we fight it. You've got to get it out of the house, and you need the support of everybody that's been a part of it to get that done. And understand the past is the past, and we can no longer follow those old rules.
Well, those are really good points, and my impression, I believe that there's a lot of effort to try to change the culture coming from national organizations, and certainly that was my experience from talking to SAE, from talking to Judd Horace, who's the new head of the North American Fraternity Conference. And I think that there's a lot of. I was struck at how self-critical alumni are and members about fraternities about fraternity behavior, and I think that in the past there's been a lot of defensiveness, and I think what I'm seeing now is I'm hoping that more of an acceptance that there has to be change, because that's kind of the first step. One of the in the chapter that I wrote about barriers toward minority membership, I mean, one of the problems is that there's going to for there to be a more diverse group, you're going to have to address sort of the history of this, which is, I mean, the problem is that when historically white fraternities began in the 19th century, they were not open to everybody, and that we understand that that's a member of a function of the past. But as a result, you have the African American fraternities, and you have other minority fraternities and sororities, and everyone has their own rush probably. So, first of all, if you don't have that many minorities to begin with, and there's a system where everyone is funneled into different rushes, that's going to make it hard. So something that they're considering in Alabama, I don't know if this is going to happen, is to have a unified rush system so that white members might consider African American fraternities and vice versa. You know, if you just got to think about how that and recruiting in high school, all of those things are going to make it a lot more difficult. But you know, most colleges are pushing for diversity, and they have programs where they're actively trying to get people to talk to each other. And if you then have a system where there's a sorting by race, which has, you know, I think it's going to go counter to that. But do they have a unified rush at all in Arkansas? Or? Oh yeah.
Kenny Gibbs, I'm part of the Sigma Nu Advisory Board at the University of Arkansas. So to John's point over here earlier, used to the Rush program was all relationship based. And so we had a Rush chairman or two, and then you had some geographically, and you only knew people that they were somebody's little brother or somebody's cousin or across the street from you growing up. And so you never met a lot of people. So they changed that to an open rush system like the girls have. So there's still that relationship base going through the summer, but then when you get up there, you go through the formal rush process and go to every house, you know, on every night. And they, you know, it's not necessarily as friendly per se, you know, because then there's this cut system. But what it does is it exposes you to fraternities that you would have never seen in the old system, plus it exposes the fraternities to people that they would have never seen. And I think that's one of the big parts that has been the increase of the popularity, as John spoke to. You know, you've got 900 men that went through Rush last year. You got 663 girls, you know, that went through Rush last year. They need more fraternities, need more sororities up there right now. And to Eric's point, I think, personally, one of the biggest things that's got to be involved is the alumni. The alumni have got to stay involved. These are 18 to 20-year-old young people. They will make mistakes. If you leave them unattended, they will make mistakes. So if you stay involved with them all the time, not part of the time, then you've got a higher probability of helping them achieve success. So I would love for any suggestions you've got, because I know this has been a big part of a lot of our lives. If you ask me, Kenny, what was the most important part of your collegiate experience? I'm not going to tell you my GPA. I'm not going to tell you my degree. I'm going to tell you the Greek system. I don't get asked, Kenny, what was your GPA? I get asked all the time. Now, what fraternity are you in? So, you know, I would ask this group 3 questions, if I may. Leave your hand up if this question applies to you. Did you meet your spouse as a result of the Greek system? Okay? Leave your hand up. Do you have a career that is somehow connected to the people you met through the Greek system? Okay, leave your hand up. The last question, I'll ask you this. If somebody you talk to on a regular basis, who's one of the best friends you've got in life, you met as a result of the Greek system, raise your hand. That's powerful.
No,
that's powerful. So
I absolutely wouldn't discount that, because, you know, I experienced that in a lot of the events I went to. I mean, I met so many people who met, you know, their best friends, the groomsmen at their weddings. They expect that their, you know, the pallbearers at their funerals will be their fraternity brothers, and that is not a small thing. I mean, we live in a society that's extremely, you know, divided by social media, and these are real, authentic connections, and people feel strongly about them. And I think, though, that you make a really good point, though, about, you know, what could change. I mean, I think that adult supervision makes sense, and that's a very I know that's very controversial in Greek life, because I know that Greek life is historically been about self-government, and you're supposed to, as a young man, try to discipline each other and try to, become role models. I would suggest that it doesn't seem like that's been working. And so having an adult living in the chapter house enforcing the rules would seem to make a lot of sense. So that's one step. Eliminating pledging would be another. It seems like pledging has just gotten completely out of control, and that would be another step. Not having alcohol in the chapter houses. And one of the big recommendations I have in the book is just much better information. I mean, you talk about GPA. I was really impressed that fraternities compete with each other on GPA. So you can look up a different chapter and say, hey, they have the highest GPA on campus. They're not really competing on safety. And the colleges should really, very prominently on each chapter's website should say exactly what each fraternity has been disciplined for. And not sort of, a lot of them just say health and safety violations, but real detail, maybe not with the names, but just so that families, parents can look at this and decide whether this is safe. It would be great if every alcohol-related hospitalization was related to a fraternity was also posted, so you could see which fraternities had the most dangerous parties. Sexual assault reports would also make sense. Then there would be the same kind of competition that you had for GPAs, and I think that would be a very powerful step.
Got a question? Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, my name is Curtis S. Woods. I'm a member of Phi Beta Sigma fraternity, founded in Howard University in 1914. I'm glad to hear the conversation about unified rush. The first African-American fraternity was founded in 1906, Cornell University Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. And of course, at that time that we could not merge or join with the white, historical white fraternities. But over the years, I can see the historically black fraternities that we're reaching out more to the white Greeks due to the fact that many of them now have joined our fraternities and sororities. Also, some of you all may not be familiar with African American fraternities. We use a routine called stepping, where we do the little dance routines. We have now reached out to our white brothers and sisters and have asked them, do they want to participate in that? And they have crossed over with that. So we're definitely seeing some changes. And so even though that may be just a little small change, but if we continue to make one change by one change, sooner or later you'll see a real big change. Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
And I think
go ahead.
Sorry.
And then we'll.
I think didn't you make Bill Clinton an honorary member? Yes, exactly. I thought that'd be worth pointing out in this environment. So yeah, that's important.
And did he do the step?
Not saying we're going to cheat.
Okay. Go ahead. Anything?
Oh no, I would just say, I mean, these are all really good points, and one of the problems here is that I definitely believe that there are a lot of well-meaning people in fraternities who would like to see a more diverse group, but because of this history and this division, you have organizations like African American fraternities that serve an incredibly important role, and so it's going to be difficult if you have a small if the campus doesn't have that many African American students to begin with. It totally makes sense that many would want to join organizations that have such a incredibly proud history in the civil rights movement. It's going to be difficult to recruit, and I think that to the extent that there can be, as you're pointing out, a closer relationship between historically white and African American fraternities and Latino fraternities, that might be a first step. But yeah, I mean, I think you make a really good point.
John, I want to thank you for being here. We're honored to have you here, and this conversation for some could be difficult, but I think it's an important national conversation to have, and I think it's important given the world that we live in and the challenges that we're facing, and 4 young men dying in 2017 and all sorts of liability issues. I think it's an important conversation. So thank you for being here, and ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming, and
thank you very
please
much.
go by True Gentlemen and visit with John. Thank you all for being here today.
Thank you very much.